Hey guys, Dr. Houlihan here again. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about 5 different things you can implement into your diet and lifestyle that can help alleviate symptoms of Crohn's, inflammatory bowel disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. Now I have a couple disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a medical doctor or a registered dietitian. I don't have any advanced degrees in nutritional sciences, so you should consult a credentialed professional if you're looking for recommendations that are more specific for you. These 5 things, while substantiated by the research, anecdotally, they have worked for me, but they may not work for every single person. So if you need more specific recommendations, consult a nutrition professional. Another disclaimer, this is going to be a research-heavy video, so if you're interested in what the scientific community has to say about these conditions over the past decade or so, stay tuned, this is the one for you. If you're not interested in the research, then this may not be the one for you. For myself personally, I was diagnosed with Crohn's in about 2016, and for the better part of the 20 teens, I was dealing with symptoms of Crohn's disease. I had all sorts of different weird stuff that was going on with me, but in about 2018, 2019, I really started to take charge of my diet and my lifestyle and start implementing these different things that I'm going to be talking to you guys about, and as of now, I'm in remission and I do not have symptoms. I'm going to be presenting these tips to you in the order that I believe are the most important and the most impactful to least important and least impactful. So my number one most important thing that you can do to reduce the symptoms of these different conditions is reducing added sugars from your diet. The key word here is added sugars. I'm not talking about carbohydrates in general, things that occur naturally in nature that our bodies have developed to process over hundreds of thousands of years. I'm talking about either laboratory synthesized additives or sugars, or even natural sugars that have just been pumped into the foods in exorbitant amounts unnecessarily. The first study I want to talk about was published this year in 2022. So this study found that people who were high consumers of sugar-sweetened beverages, so we're talking about sodas, we're talking about sports drinks, we're talking about juices, high consumers of these beverages had a higher erythrocyte sedimentation rate, higher monocytosis, and a higher C-reactive protein content. So these are all markers of inflammation, and as the name of these different conditions suggests, inflammation is not something you want. So sugar causes inflammation in your body. Less sugar means less inflammation. So the next study I want to talk about was published in 2016. This study was basically talking about how the Western diet affects inflammatory bowel diseases, and it found that components of the Western diet, including fast food, red meat, sugar consumption, those things are all increasing factors of inflammation, inflammatory bowel conditions, whereas consuming a diet more consistent with the Mediterranean diet, which I published a video on earlier this year, you can go check that out if you want more information. The Mediterranean diet and having a diverse microbiome are both factors that decrease inflammation and decrease the likelihood of inflammatory bowel conditions. So this next study is interesting. This one was published in 2015 and it was looking at different dietary patterns and the risk for inflammatory bowel conditions. This study found that increased sugar consumption and soft drink consumption had an increased risk of ulcerative colitis, but only if these patients had a lower intake of vegetables. So this shows us that to some degree the fiber that we get from eating vegetables can attenuate the negative effects of consuming increased amounts of sugar. Which leads me to my next tip. Tip number 2 is increasing the amount of fiber that you get in your diet. This study was published back in 2013. The important findings from this one was that consumption of animal protein typically increases inflammation in the gut and has a pro-inflammatory effect and increases the likelihood for inflammatory bowel diseases, whereas fiber does just the opposite. It has a protective effect against inflammatory bowel diseases. Now this next study sums it up pretty well. This is a study published in 2015. It was a meta-analysis, which if you're not familiar, it basically means they took a bunch of research and pooled all of the results and seeing what all the research is saying. So this study demonstrated that not only does fiber have a protective effect against inflammatory bowel diseases, but there is a linear dose-response relationship, meaning the more fiber you eat, the less likely it is you are to develop inflammatory bowel conditions. So this study found that for every 10 grams of fiber included in the diet, there's a 13% reduced risk of inflammatory bowel conditions. So my third tip is to consume a variety of natural foods. Variety and natural are both going to be important factors here. So this study published back in 2013, the title pretty much says it all. A healthy gastrointestinal microbiome is dependent on dietary diversity. So getting more diversity in your diet is going to be helpful. This next study, published just this year in 2022, substantiates those same assertions from the previous study. It showed that microbiome health was associated with higher fruit and vegetable intake. So again, the more plants that you're able to eat, the more healthier your gut microbiome is, the less inflammation you're going to have. This next study is an interesting one. It was published in 2019, and while we know that there's a lot of different factors that contribute to an unhealthy gut diversity and unhealthy microbiome and more inflammatory bowel conditions, it found that more so than smoking, more so than non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and more so than antibiotics, diet was the most impactful factor in terms of the development and exacerbation of inflammatory bowel conditions. So now we're going to talk about eating foods that are more natural, less additives, less processing, things like that. This first study was published in 2019. This study actually goes into pretty in-depth detail into a lot of very specific different additives that are found in foods, but essentially it found that added sweeteners, added salts, and all sorts of other common additives in foods exacerbated colitis, or inflammation within the colon. Okay, so this next study was published just last year in 2021, talking about ultra-processed foods and their effect on inflammatory bowel diseases. There's a lot of debate going on about what an ultra-processed food really is, what effects they have on our health. The more steps there is between your cow dying or your fruit being picked or your vegetable being pulled out of the ground, and when you put it in your body, that is what ultra-processing means. This study basically showed that the increased consumption of ultra-processed foods increases the incidence of inflammatory bowel diseases. So the less steps there is between your food being harvested and you consuming the food, the better. Okay, so my fourth tip in terms of helping alleviate symptoms is going to be fasting or time-restricted eating. I know there's some nuanced differences between the two, but for these purposes, basically just think about it as a large chunk of your day where you're not consuming food. So this first study, published back in 2006, contains more subjective than objective data, basically talking about how people felt. And so that they determined that the people who did the fasting diet versus a conventional diet, they had improvement in 7 out of 10 irritable bowel syndrome symptoms as compared to the control group. This next study was published just last year in 2021. It might shed some insight as to why these people felt better doing the fasting diet versus a conventional diet. So this study demonstrated that intermittent fasting increases the abundance of protective and beneficial bacteria within the gut. So the intermittent fasting helped foster a healthier gut microbiome, which we know is related to decreased incidence of inflammatory bowel diseases. So an application of this most people might already be familiar with is Ramadan, where people are fasting from sun up to sundown. This study, published all the way back in 2012, demonstrated that during Ramadan, people have reduced amounts of pro-inflammatory cytokines within their body. So again, if you have anything that is pro-inflammatory being reduced, that is going to benefit you in terms of avoiding inflammatory bowel conditions. Okay, so my last tip in terms of reducing the symptoms of inflammatory bowel diseases is a couple of additives that I like to put into my diet, and I like the addition of fermented foods and CBD. This study was published back in 2017, and it demonstrated that fermented foods support a healthy gut microbiome. Now, fermented foods, if you're not familiar, it could be things like kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, wine, yogurt. Those are some examples of fermented food. My fermented food of choice is kombucha, also sometimes yogurt, but just including those things into your diet too can help support a healthy microbiome. In terms of CBD, this was a study published back in 2018. Again, this would have more subjective rather than objective results from this study, but the people taking the CBD supplement just felt better in general than the people who were not. I myself have probably tried a dozen different CBD products trying to find one that worked best for me. The one that I find works the best for me in terms of attenuating my symptoms is a tincture by Token CBD, which is a company out of Oregon. It's relatively inexpensive and it works for me, so try it out if you're still looking for something like a CBD product to help with your symptoms. Okay, so those are my 5 tips in terms of things that you can do in your diet and your lifestyle to help reduce the symptoms of Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. Feel free to drop any questions or comments down below. I love hearing your guys' success stories, and if you have any thoughts or experiences to the contrary of this evidence here, then I'd love to hear about that too. I'll have more videos on the way soon, and I'll see you guys next time.